Joining us right now, Democratic strategist Michelle Thomas and Republican strategist Melik Abdul. Thank you both for being here as always on a Sunday. John Fetterman, Democratic senator from Pennsylvania, also very supportive as well on policy like on immigration and the economy. Now that the majority of Americans agree with those policies, we have to address one that has been very polarizing. January 6th, the president-elect saying in an interview he would pardon Americans who participated in those protests on January 6th. To both of you, lightning answer here, please. Is it possible that in the same way that many of us had heard or presumed what so many pollsters predicted, the opposite results of this election and how it turned out, is it possible on January 6th, the story we've been hearing and the story surrounding those serving time needs another look? Melik, I'll start with you.
There are a number of people, I think probably about 1,000 plus people who were eventually charged. Not all of them went to jail. Now, I don't know the details of what Donald Trump is talking about, but I imagine, and I would be okay with it, if for those who received any type of charges but weren't actually convicted or sentenced to jail, because a number of those were not. They were simple trespassing charges, nothing about attacking officers or even many who didn't go inside the Capitol itself. So I think that it's appropriate if he wants to vote those who were convicted on those nonviolent charges. Joe Biden opened the door for it at this point. So he's given his son immunity from any prosecutions over a 10-year period. So I think it's very reasonable for Donald Trump to pardon those who were not convicted or guilty of any type of nonviolent crime.
And Michelle, I've got to go to you. I mean, Melik just touched on it. Did Hunter's reprieve justify or give some sense of balance of justice to pardoning those January 6 demonstrators?
Absolutely not. There's actually no relation between the president's decision to pardon his son, who he believed was a target due to political motivations, and persons who attempted to overthrow the government. All those persons who participated in the January 6th insurrection should be brought to justice, and that does not include pardoning those persons who have been convicted. When you look at the mass destruction essentially that occurred on January 6th, those persons who have been punished should have been punished, and the justice system needs to play out. That does not invite, the Hunter Biden pardon does not invite the incoming president to interfere with the justice process by issuing pardons to those persons who attempted to overthrow the government.
Melik, there is obviously a different perspective on this panel. There's a different perspective for so many in America, but even those who believe it was absolutely wrong for any of these people to enter the Capitol on January 6th, there are a lot of Americans who see obvious bias in not just reporting, but in prosecutions. It's not popular to even talk about this, but there are U.S. citizens who see a nation where the people who rushed into the Capitol, no one had a bomb. They were seen as a threat to the society, as a threat to the government. Meanwhile, 1,000 buildings were destroyed or damaged in Minneapolis following George Floyd's death. Few people were charged there. There have been other instances where people have assaulted officers. There's been violence in the streets. They've taken down and burned down businesses. Immigrants who are in the country illegally have been released into the country and committed heinous crimes. Will January 6th pardons bring closure, do you think, or balance for those who feel there's been a miscarriage of justice in this country?
I don't think it is, because many people will see it as a political act. And I'll disagree with my colleague. Joe Biden did this because he said he was afraid or had concerns about what Donald Trump may do. But what his son did was commit a crime. You can say that those people who trespass onto Capitol grounds committed a crime, sure. But Donald Trump may be considering pardoning those. But Hunter Biden was literally given immunity over a 10-year period. So I think that is actually saying that the systems is stacked against him when Joe Biden is president of the United States. And now he's saying that his Justice Department is being weaponized against his own son. So I think that there are very good parallels. But at the end of the day, whether or not Donald Trump does or not, pardons are inherently political, and people will continue to look at them this way, whether Donald Trump does it or not.
Michelle, I want to give you a chance to respond to Melik's point there.
Yeah, the problem here is you have the persons who participate in the insurrection attacking democracy as we know it. The difference here is that and I believe former Attorney General Eric Holder brought this point out, was that the crimes for which Hunter Biden was convicted would never have been charged in the first place, but for most likely political motivations.
Thanks so much for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.